Hello and welcome as we look forward to the fourth Sunday or weekend of the Lenten time, which brings us pretty much halfway through the season of Lent. The scripture readings assigned for this week are from the book of Joshua, chapter 5, verses 9a, and then verses 10 and 12. From the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 17 through 21, and from the gospel tradition of Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 and 3 through 3, and then verses 11 through 32. Now, this week, the gospel presents to us one of the more famous stories found in the whole of the New Testament. In fact, it is a story along with the story of the Good Samaritan that belong alone to the Lucan tradition. And as I say, the story that we're going to hear is the story of the prodigals. Certainly everyone in some way, regardless of whether they're Christian or not even, have heard the story of the prodigal son or the prodigal father, and the story of the Good Samaritan. We are indebted, therefore, to this third gospel writer for two really gems of the New Testament tradition. Now, chapter 15 presents three parables, each of them linked in a certain way. And what we're going to hear this time is the third of those three parables. But it's important as we begin to notice how chapter 15 begins. It pictures Jesus as being present with the scribes and the Pharisees, and their concern, as Jesus is pictured as eating with saints, and not with saints, but with sinners and tax collectors. And they, of course, from the viewpoint of the leadership of the time, represented in some ways the worst of the population that there could be. And so the complaint of the scribes and the Pharisees is the foil against which Jesus now will give these three parables. It's important, and I pointed this out in the past, that the Pharisees are not always as bad as sometimes later tradition will see them. But it is true in this particular instance that they are the foil for Jesus giving a vision of what God's kingdom is like to those who are opposed to what Jesus is doing. Keep in mind, and it's a kind of concern, we have mentioned this before with regard to the Lucan gospel, that the audience to which this gospel may have originally been directed were those who enjoyed certain good status in life, whom we might call the rich and the powerful. And so many of the first Christians, as Luke's community was developed, belonged to this group. It's interesting. And therefore, that's often why his concern is, that is, Jesus' concern, is very much how those who are endowed with God's gifts use them, and whether they use them or not. So the fact that Jesus is pictured, and these are the opening three verses, by the way, that we will hear of the gospel this week, that he is eating with sinners, include not only those who have in some ways really violated life's rules and principles, but there are also those who sit on the fringe of society. Not those who belong, if one wants, to the inner circle, but to those who in some way find themselves isolated from the larger centering group. So Jesus, therefore, is eating with sinners. Now, we've pointed out before, sin, simply the Hebrew word for sin, is to miss the mark. In other words, there are certain things that hopefully we do, certain things maybe that we don't do, that put us on target with our relationship to God, but also our relationship to others. So to sin, literally miss the target. The archery image, of course, is very much at work here, is it not? So the fact that Jesus dines with and eats with sinners disturbs those in position of leadership and power and, as I mentioned, probably riches. So all of that is a little background now to three parables. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at the first two parables because later in the year of Luke, we will have an opportunity to examine them in more depth. But let me, at least in passing, point out what they are. First of all, it's a parable of a man who has 100 sheep, loses one of the sheep, and goes in search of him. When he finds him, puts him on his shoulder, brings him back, calls the community together to rejoice with him. This is followed by a second parable of a woman who has 10 denarii, loses one of them, sweeps the floor of her house until she finds it, calls in her neighbors, her friends, and says, "Rejoice with me." There's an obvious parallel to these two stories. The parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin. It matches one of the traditions that Luke is famous for, namely him and her stories. So shepherds were generally always men. Women, losing the coin in this case, it's a woman's story. But the connection is quite obvious. Something is lost, a search takes place, something is found, the calling together of the community, and rejoices. So we will look at a little bit more in detail, as I say, later in the year when we come to examine those two parables alone. They are, as I pointed out, his and her parables, but they do match the concern now of the third parable, which we're going to look at this week. And by the way, the parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the prodigal are all uniquely characteristics of Luke's story. So they are, although lost sheep are found in Matthew, it takes on a very different tone and a different explanation. So just to point out the originality, if you want, of Luke's story, gospel in this regard. Now, many, I suspect, are familiar with with this parable. Sometimes it's known as the Prodigal Son. More recent times, certain interpreters have called it the story of the Prodigal Father. Others will call it, because there are going to be two sons here, the story of the prodigal and his two sons. Others will call this maybe the parable of the lost. And all of those are different ways, perhaps, of zooming in on this particular account. Now, the father has, and that's how this begins, two sons. This is not unusual in biblical tradition to refer to two sons. Those of you who might be a little more familiar with the Hebrew Bible will remember that Abraham had two sons, Isaac had two sons, Joseph had two sons, Tamar and Judah had two sons, David and Bathsheba have two sons. So the idea of two sons has an interesting biblical background to them. And what often happens in each of these particular instances, the younger is favored over the older. So again, you can go back, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael is the older, Isaac is the younger of Abraham's sons. And you can go and kind of notice that. So clearly, as we've noted a couple of times, although the audience that Luke is directing his gospel is to a Gentile, community, he is very familiar with the Hebrew tradition and perhaps very familiar with the fact that much of his community, although they are Gentile, also come from the tradition that Jesus grew up in, namely the tradition of Judaism. In this case, the younger son, the favored one, comes to his father. Now, as you remember, he says to his father, please, I don't know whether he said please, but he says, give me the inheritance that is due to me. Well, now keep in mind, there are different interpreters of this particular statement on the part of the young boy. Is he putting his father in a corner? Is he shaming him? Because young boys did not talk to their father in this way with regard to the inheritance. Be that as it may, that is, the father agrees to the request of the younger son. Therefore, what he does is he takes the total value of his goods and gives half of it, not before he dies, but while he is still alive, to the younger son. Now again, this father, if you think about it, is pictured as rather well-to-do. He has servants, he has abundant property and goods, fitting again the kind of the background that Luke often sees as important for his audience to recognize, because if they saw this, then they would see more a real relationship in their own lives than perhaps if they were simply the poor financially and say, oh, well, see how that works. So the decision is made. The young man takes his inheritance and goes away to a foreign land. Now, just where that is, we don't know. Foreign would be any place outside of Israel. It could be somewhere in the Middle East. It could be somewhere in Asia Minor. Wherever it is, having this well-to-do riches in his possession, now, and here the word is, depending on the translator, squandered. He or some say in loose living. Well, after all, if you are known to have a great amount of money, I suppose that it's easy for friends to say, listen, how you doing? Let's celebrate. And that seems to be what happens to the young boy. He goes through the wealth that he has very quickly, so quickly that he loses everything. Now, we don't know how he loses all that money. Again, you can make a lot of speculation about that. But and then a famine, to make the story really work, a famine strikes the land. So he has no place to go. He hires himself out to kind of keep alive, and apparently gets hired, one might probably argue here, by what we would call a Gentile, because he raises pigs. And there's a certain, if you're Jewish, kind of smile and say, pigs, pork, of course, are what we would know, what they knew as the unclean animal. And he finds himself feeding pigs. Therefore, he's working for someone else, feeding pigs with pods, which he himself would eat, but no one invited him to. So clearly, also the guy he works for is also not showing any hospitality, which would be a characteristic or a quality that he ought to show. Chlorid pads are what the text mentioned, were a wild variety of bitter berries. And in fact, if you ate too many of them, they nauseated you. And you know what that might lead to. But if you're really hungry, you would, I suppose you could say, eat anything. So talk about reducing the guy to really the pits. And hunger, of course, always very important, by the way, as I've mentioned many times in Luke's story, food is one of the kind of regular characteristics of his stories. After all, where was he telling this story? Eating with sinners, so obviously there was food. So now this boy, young man, has nothing. Now he's pictured, depending on how you translate this, but let's take the translation, coming to his senses. What does that mean? Well, he now sees his situation as somewhat desperate, and he remembers that in his father's house, the servants had more than enough to eat each day. So keep in mind, again, the father is well off to be able to kind of have servants and this kind of arrangement. And the young man realizes that he can't survive any longer where he is, or he will die, says, I will return to my father's house. Now, this is how you find translators, and we'll say, one way to say it, a very popular way, is I will say to my father, I'm truly sorry for what I have done. I repent of the kind of actions I have taken. I do not ask to be treated as your son, but only as you would treat a servant. All right, thus one could make an argument, and many homilies would reflect this, a certain repentance. However, perhaps there's another way to see this. Luke's stories are often very practical. Practicality that the young boy sees is, I'm hungry, I'm starving, back in Dad's household, at least the servants have something to eat. Here's what I will do. I will go back and tell my father that I am sorry for what I have done. I don't deserve to be served as your son, but only as a servant. Now, how do I do this? How do I say it? And here's where tone becomes important, I think. You could really have sincerity. Truly, he is moved. He's made a mistake. He's sorry for this. He really does not expect to be treated as a son anymore, but rather as someone who is a servant, where hospitality will at least be given to the stranger, in this case a son who has alienated himself from the family and welcomed back. But maybe, how do you do that? Well, Dad, here, I'm really sorry for this. I really don't deserve to be considered your son anymore. Just treat me like a servant. Could it be that he practices a little bit to say this in just the right way, that he can kind of communicate to his father, if you want, the sincerity of his repentance? And that makes for good homilies. But perhaps, as I mentioned, if he says it this way, I just got to kind of butter him up a little bit, because practically I need help, and I know that he would give it to me if I do it in the right way. So all of that is the determining factor of the young boy returning to his household. Now the parable continues, however, at that point by pointing out that the father has been eagerly awaiting the return of his son. Interestingly, he somehow knows that this separation that has taken place is not forever, and therefore, we can only picture him as looking kind of over horizons or something, waiting for this son, lost son if you want, to return. And when he sees him coming, he runs out to meet him. Now even that gesture is interesting. Some interpreters have said old people do not run to young people. Well, that's one interpretation. Be that as it may, his eagerness, and maybe you can sympathize with that, to welcome back his son causes him to quickly go to greet him. And his son begins, Father, and he, that is, the father, refuses to even let him give his speech. Now maybe the father knew what the speech was going to be, I often think, but it's not said. But rather he looks at his son and says, your mother is not going to like the way she sees her returning boy. So he says to the servants, give him a robe, Give him shoes for his feet. Give him a ring for his finger. The ring for the finger restores the son to the family. Very important. And then he says, and let us kill the fatted calf and celebrate, for this son of mine has returned. Now here's the sense of lost, found, rejoicing. So the lost boy, if you want, returns, and the father now encourages everyone on his household to rejoice at the loss of this boy, at the lost boy's return. So notice there's a kind of community aspect to it. I point this out because when he says, kill the fatted calf, keep in mind that there's a lot of meat in a fatted calf, okay? Not that I'm a great butcher, but I'm sure that you probably might appreciate this. And therefore, all of that meat that was prepared would be shared not just with the boy and his family immediately, but with all of those who were on, if you want, the farm or the plantation. So that there is a commonness that the father asks the community to share with him the joy of the son who has returned. So sometimes, as a little aside here, this, as I said, is called the prodigal. Now, what does prodigal mean? Well, the very word prodigal means wasteful. So some have pointed out, yes, the son, younger son, has been wasteful with the goods that he took with him, but maybe it's the father who might be better called the prodigal, the wasteful. He does not be needing apologies or people asking. He is just simply going to give them, and give them without any particular request. So often in the past, this is where the parable has ended. The lost son, the prodigal son is returned. Everything, as good stories go, ends well, and everyone is happy. But Luke now brings in the other son, the older brother. And it's interesting. He is returning from the field. He's been helping the family. He's been working with his father, for his father. I want to say with his father, but at least for his father. And as he's returning to the household, he hears all this celebration going on and says to one of the servants, "What's happening? What did I miss?" And the servant says, "Well, your brother has returned home and we are celebrating." The elder brother now stops. One can almost see this if you're watching it more dramatically, and says, "I'm not going into the house with that boy back. He's cut his bridges. He should pay the price of what he has done. This being welcomed back, how does this make any sense?" You can almost begin to sympathize, and that's why this elder son, in some ways, may be much more the challenge than the younger son. The father, again unnamed here, but father comes out to greet his other son. So in both cases, now whether he ran out, we don't know, but in both cases, the father greets the son, and he says to this son, "Look, your brother is returned. He was lost and has been found. We need to celebrate." The older brother now kind of looks at his father and says, "Really? Look it. Have I not remained," in so many words, "have I not remained faithful and loyal to you all the time? Have I not helped to make things work here for not only you, but the family, but also for the larger community? Have I not bore the heat of the day in making sure that things go well and are taken care of? And yet you never once let me celebrate with my friends with a goat." Now, this goat meat is not a whole lot as compared to this great calf meat that they're celebrating. Also, maybe this elder son is saying, look, you never told me about all of this. You never consulted me about whether I felt good about your giving away half the inheritance to my brother. And he says, this son of yours. Now watch the words. He therefore alienates himself from his brother, who he says carried on. And he even suggests that some of the things that he carried on doing were not according to the law. Associating, he says, with prostitutes and others. So he makes up a kind of angry scenario with regard to his relationship with his brother. He is the one who now finds himself alienated or lost, not only from his father, but also from his brother. And there may be some criticism here. Why did the father not consult with him about some things? How did the father treat him? There are a lot of different angles that one can use in this parable, and why it remains, I think, one of the most interesting and challenging of parables that we find in the New Testament. The father obviously is the main character, and both sons revolve around him. Has the father played favorites with the younger? Questions that maybe the audience of Luke, and maybe as we hear it, our sympathies may at first really gravitate more to this son than to the first son. It's all well and good to say you're sorry and be forgiven, but this son has not really done anything to seek forgiveness, or has he? What has been his relationship with his father over the time between the leaving of his brother and his return? And so, we're not quite sure here, and this is how good parables, as I've mentioned a few times, end, not with giving an answer, but with raising a question. And so, the father says to this son, we must rejoice and be glad because this brother of yours has been lost and has been found. That's how it ends. What do we not know? We do not know what the elder son does. Did he return? Did he carry the grudge? What exactly will be his response to the whole community once again being able to come together? Or will he choose to stay outside of the community? Will he choose to not give forgiveness to his brother? So characteristics that are certainly part of this very, very important and wonderful parable open the window or the door, whatever you want, to a number of possible interpretations. Certainly, there is a certain sympathy, I think, that we can find going to the elder brother, but in a certain way, he too was not always as nice to his father as sometimes he made himself out to be. See, so you got to go back and look at both of these sons. What is their relationship to their father? What is their relationship to each other? We really have no understanding of what was the relationship between the two brothers at the time that the youngest left. Did he leave because he was in some kind of conflict with his brother? See, so there are a number of very human elements here, family elements, if you want, in this parable. The father may remain the center, but the activities of his two siblings, or the two siblings, is unknown. So for those of you who really appreciate a well-crafted story, a well-crafted narrative, this is certainly one of the very best examples that we find in the New Testament. Again, going back to the opening line of chapter 15, Jesus sits with sinners as well as with saints. He eats with those whom the leadership have not felt comfortable he should be. May it be said as we move through these Lenten days that we do all that we can to bring together all of the families, members of our faith family, no matter who they are, how they act, where they might be. Of course, some of you are saying, as I would say, easier said than done. We don't know what the elder son did. We can only hope that he did the right thing, as I know you would do if that challenge were given you. Thank you for being with us, and again, hope to see you